Welcome back to Jean, where real women share the moments they refused to be small and the victories that followed. Tonight's story is one of those rare moments when a single, quiet sentence can change the balance of power in a room. It comes from Eleanor Bishop, a 62-year-old woman whose life has been anything but ordinary, though you wouldn't know it from the way she dresses, the way she carries herself, or the way she chooses her words. This is the story of a dinner party. An insult slipped between sips of wine, and the kind of reply that doesn't just silence a room, it rearranges it. Eleanor has always believed that real power doesn't shout. It doesn't have to. And she was about to prove it without raising her voice, without lifting a finger, and without a single hint of anger. The November air outside was sharp enough to sting, the kind of cold that makes the city lights in Chicago seem brighter. Eleanor stepped out of her modest brownstone apartment and pulled her cashmere coat tighter around her shoulders. The coat wasn't new, she'd had it for nearly a decade, but the tailoring was impeccable, and it still draped like the day she bought it. She could have worn any number of designer pieces from her walk-in closet, but tonight wasn't about making an entrance. It was about blending in, about letting people underestimate her, as they so often did. In her world, invisibility was the ultimate advantage. Her driver, an older gentleman named Thomas, who had been with her since the early years of her company, waited by the car, holding the rear door open. He didn't wear a uniform, just a dark wool coat and a quiet smile. No one in her son's neighborhood had ever guessed he was anything more than a friendly neighbor offering her a ride. "Ready for another round?" he asked as she slid into the back seat. "Always," Eleanor said with a faint smile. Her son Daniel's home was in a leafy suburb just outside the city, the kind of place where houses looked old enough to be charming but new enough to have heated floors and perfectly staged kitchens. By the time she arrived, the front windows glowed warm against the cold night. She could see silhouettes moving inside Daniel's tall frame, Vanessa's sharper one. She could hear laughter, the muffled kind that comes from wine poured too early and too often. When she stepped through the door, the scent of rosemary chicken hit her first. Her son greeted her with a quick hug, but his eyes flickered to his wife before they returned to his mother. "Mom, you made it. Wouldn't miss it," she said. Vanessa appeared from the dining room, wine glass in hand, smile fixed in place. She looked stunning in that effortless, curated way. She had hair swept up, makeup precise, earrings that caught the light just enough to be noticed. "Eleanor," she said, leaning in for a kiss on the cheek. "Come in. We're just about to sit down." The dining table was long enough to seat 10, though tonight there were only 6 of them. Eleanor, Daniel, Vanessa, and a few of Vanessa's friends from her charity circle. The women greeted Eleanor with polite nods, clearly sizing her up in that way people do when they're trying to figure out where you fit in their social hierarchy. She gave them nothing to work with, just a warm smile and a compliment about the centerpiece, a simple arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus. Dinner began with light conversation, work updates from Daniel, chatter about the upcoming holiday season, a few remarks about the unusually early snowfall in the city. Eleanor answered when spoken to but kept her focus on observing. Years in business had taught her that people reveal more when you say less. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa topped off her wine and leaned back in her chair. She laughed at something one of her friends said, then turned to Daniel. "You know," she said, her tone light, almost playful, "sometimes I feel like your mother is kind of a pest." It was the kind of line meant to sound harmless, but Eleanor knew better. She could hear the sharp edge under the sugar. The table went still, just for a beat. Daniel froze mid-bite, his fork suspended in the air. Vanessa's friends exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't frown, didn't bristle, didn't give Vanessa the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Instead, she placed her fork gently on her plate, reached for her glass of water, and took a slow sip. When she set the glass down, she looked directly at Vanessa, not unkindly, but with the quiet, steady gaze of someone who sees far more than she says. "Vanessa," she said, her voice calm and almost gentle, "if being a pest means caring enough to notice things others miss, I suppose I've been one my whole life. Her words were simple, almost self-deprecating, but something in her tone made the table shift. Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly, though she recovered quickly, letting out a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Inside, Eleanor felt nothing but stillness. She had learned long ago that the best responses don't need volume. They need weight. And weight is built over years in boardrooms and negotiations, in the countless moments when she'd been underestimated and had quietly, methodically, proven people wrong. As conversation resumed, she let Vanessa believe the moment had passed. Let her think the comment had rolled off without consequence. But Eleanor knew better, because in her world, you didn't need to raise your voice to win. You just needed to choose the right moment to play your hand. And tonight, that moment had just been set in motion. The clink of cutlery filled the silence Vanessa had left behind. It was subtle but heavy, the kind of quiet that makes every sound louder. Daniel shifted in his seat, pushing the food around his plate without eating. Across the table, Vanessa's friends glanced between them, as if waiting for a signal on how to react. Eleanor's reply still hung in the air, light in delivery but unyielding in tone. She had not raised her voice, yet she knew everyone at the table had heard more than the words. They had heard the authority under them. Vanessa, determined to reclaim the moment, reached for the serving dish and offered more potatoes to the woman on her left. Her laugh was just a fraction too bright, her conversation just a shade too fast. Eleanor had seen this before in boardrooms, the scramble to smooth over a misstep before anyone noticed. Except here, the people at the table had noticed. Eleanor took a slow breath, letting her mind settle into observation mode. She had built an empire by reading people, not just their words but the way they held a fork, the direction their eyes darted, the tension in their shoulders. Tonight she was reading every detail. Daniel's discomfort was clear. He avoided his wife's gaze, choosing instead to ask his mother questions about the weather in her neighborhood, whether she had tried the new cafe that had opened near her building. His voice had the careful tone of someone steering the conversation away from dangerous waters. Vanessa played along, though her eyes flickered toward Eleanor with a kind of challenge, as though daring her to engage further. Eleanor smiled faintly, answering her son's questions with warmth, never once giving Vanessa the reaction she sought. When the main course was cleared, Vanessa's friend Julia leaned forward. She was the kind of woman who wore confidence like a perfume, obvious and lingering. "Eleanor," she said, "Vanessa tells me you're retired now. That must be relaxing, not having to worry about work anymore." Eleanor rested her folded hands on the table. "I wouldn't call it retirement. I stepped away from daily operations, but I still have responsibilities. I just choose which ones are worth my time." Julia smiled, though it was the kind of smile people wear when they think they have you figured out. "That sounds lovely. I imagine you must have had quite the career." "I did," Eleanor said simply. She left it there, not offering details, letting the silence after her words become its own statement. Dessert was served, small slices of lemon tart with dollops of cream. Vanessa's movements were precise, her hospitality rehearsed, but her energy was off balance. Eleanor could feel it. When Julia and the others began chatting about their upcoming charity gala, Vanessa leaned into the conversation. "We're still finalizing the guest list," she said, "but we're making sure it's people who can really contribute. It's one thing to show up. It's another to actually make an impact." The implication was clear, though no one commented. Eleanor knew Vanessa liked to believe she and Daniel moved in elite circles. What she didn't realize was that Eleanor's quiet presence in those circles went deeper than she could imagine. Many of the donors Vanessa hoped to court had once sat across a negotiating table from Eleanor, signing contracts that carried her signature. Eleanor cut a small piece of lemon tart, savoring it before speaking. "Contribution takes many forms. Some people give money, others open doors. The smart ones know how to do both." Vanessa's fork paused midway to her mouth. She recovered quickly, but Eleanor caught the flicker of thought behind her eyes. After dessert, Vanessa suggested coffee in the living room. The group migrated there, cups in hand. The seating arrangement was almost theatrical. Vanessa on the plush armchair, Daniel perched beside her, their friends on the couch, and Eleanor in a smaller chair near the window. It was a deliberate placement, positioning Eleanor slightly apart, as if she were an observer rather than a participant. She didn't mind. From that spot, she had a clear view of everyone's expressions. The conversation shifted to travel trips planned, destinations dreamed of. Julia spoke of Paris, another friend of a ski trip in Aspen. Vanessa mentioned a potential getaway to the Amalfi Coast in spring. Of course, it depends on whether Daniel can get away from work, Vanessa said. He's been so busy lately, and with everything else going on, we have to prioritize. Eleanor could feel the subtle weight of the words, everything else going on. The unspoken suggestion that her son's attention had to be managed, perhaps away from his mother. Daniel excused himself to take a call, leaving the women in the room. Vanessa leaned back, swirling the last of her coffee. You know, Eleanor, she began, I've always admired your persistence. You never seem to take no for an answer. The choice of words was telling. Admired was a compliment on the surface. Persistence a double-edged blade. Eleanor met her gaze evenly. Life has taught me that no often means not yet. People change their minds when they realize the value in saying yes. Vanessa's lips curved, but it was not a warm smile. I suppose that's one way to look at it. One of many, Eleanor replied. The air between them was charged, though the others in the room seemed unaware. It was the kind of invisible duel. Eleanor excelled at no raised voices, no overt challenges, just a quiet exchange of power. When the evening wound down, Eleanor rose first, thanking Vanessa for hosting. She embraced her son, promising to call him the next day. As she stepped into the cool night air, Thomas opened the car door for her. Good evening? He asked as she settled into the seat. It was informative, Eleanor said. Her tone was calm, but her mind was already in motion. Thomas glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She said something, didn't she? She did, Eleanor replied. And now, I'll decide what to do with it. The car pulled away from the warm glow of Daniel's home, back toward the quiet streets where Eleanor lived. Her building's doorman greeted her with a respectful nod as she entered. Inside her apartment, she hung her coat, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The skyline glittered against the night sky, each light a reminder of what she had built. People often mistook her quiet for passivity. Vanessa had made that mistake tonight. It would not be the last. But Eleanor had no intention of correcting her just yet. Power was most effective when the other person realized too late that it was already in play. The night after the dinner, Chicago's streets were still slick from a light rain, the air carrying that damp metallic scent of the city after dark. Eleanor's apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness she cherished. Yet, her mind kept replaying Vanessa's voice at the table, the almost playful way she had said it. Kind of a pest. Words could be disarmed in seconds, but the intention behind them lingered. Eleanor had heard far worse in her life: boardroom slights, whispered insults from competitors, dismissive tones from men who thought she didn't belong at the table. Every one of them had underestimated her. Everyone had regretted it. Still, there was a difference between rivals in business and family in your own dining circle. Family required a different kind of strategy. It was not about crushing someone outright. It was about rearranging the ground they stood on so they understood the cost of disrespect without ever hearing the word punishment. The following Saturday, Eleanor attended a brunch at Daniel and Vanessa's home. It was a casual affair. Avocado toast, fresh fruit, a pitcher of mimosas on the counter. Vanessa had invited a few of her friends again, and the conversation was light. Eleanor moved easily among them, contributing just enough to appear engaged while keeping her focus on listening. Halfway through, she excused herself to the powder room. On her way back, she heard voices from the kitchen. The tone caught her attention, not the content at first, but the rhythm of it. There was a certain confidence in people's voices when they believed no one could hear them. Vanessa's voice rose above the others. She means well, I guess, but she's everywhere, always checking in, always asking questions. Daniel says, she's just being a mom, but sometimes it feels like she's watching us, you know? Like she's waiting to catch us doing something wrong. One of the friends laughed softly. Maybe she's just lonely. Vanessa's response was quick. Lonely or not, I don't need her hovering. And I definitely don't need her opinions on how we run our lives. It's like she thinks she knows better than everyone else. Eleanor paused just outside the doorway, her expression unreadable. She had trained herself long ago not to react in the moment. Instead, she listened as Vanessa's voice dropped to a more conspiratorial tone. I told Daniel we need more space from her. I mean, she's sweet in her own way, but she doesn't fit into our world. She doesn't understand how things work now. Eleanor absorbed every word. Not with hurt, but with clarity. Vanessa's perception of her was based on what she saw. A modest apartment, simple clothes, a quiet presence. What she did not see was the scope of Eleanor's influence, the reach of her resources, the depth of her connections. When Eleanor stepped into the kitchen, the conversation had already shifted to holiday plans. Vanessa smiled as if nothing had been said, offering her a fresh cup of coffee. Eleanor accepted it with a steady gaze that did not waver. She knew Vanessa's type well, the kind who believed power came from appearances and proximity to the right social circles. Eleanor had built her life proving that true power came from what could not be seen. The rest of the brunch passed without incident. Eleanor spoke warmly with Daniel, asked after his work projects, and complimented the spread. But under that surface calm, the first threads of a plan began to weave together. That evening, Eleanor sat at her desk in the study. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, mementos from travels, and framed photographs of milestones in her career. She opened her laptop and began reviewing her estate documents. Her attorney, Samuel Crane, was one of the few people who knew the full extent of her holdings. She sent him a short message. Samuel, I would like to schedule a meeting next week to discuss revisions to my will and certain trust allocations. Please keep this confidential until we speak. She closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, and let her mind settle on the years of work that had brought her here, the negotiations, the acquisitions, the calculated risks. She had built her fortune not by accident, but by strategy. And she had no intention of allowing it to be squandered by someone who measured worth in dinner party status and vacation destinations. The next day, she made a series of calls. One to an old friend who ran a prominent charity in the city. Another to a contact in a luxury real estate firm. A third to a former business partner now on the board of a private bank. None of the conversations mentioned Vanessa. They were about upcoming events, possible collaborations, and invitations to gatherings in the coming months. But each call was part of a quiet network. Eleanor maintained a network that would subtly shift the circles Vanessa thought she owned. That Friday, as snow began to fall outside her window, Eleanor received confirmation from Samuel for their meeting. It was set for Tuesday morning in his downtown office. She marked it in her calendar without fanfare. She did not intend to remove Daniel from her will entirely, but the structure of her estate could be adjusted to ensure that any benefits bypassed Vanessa's direct control. There were ways to protect assets, to log them into trusts that could not be touched by anyone without the discipline to handle them wisely. For now, she would say nothing. Let Vanessa continue believing she had the upper hand. Let her think Eleanor was a harmless presence who could be dismissed with a casual remark. It was the same principle Eleanor had used in business countless times: allow the other party to grow comfortable, then shift the terms so subtly they only realized the change when the deal was already done. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the snow blanket the city in white. In the distance, she could see the lights of the lakefront. She thought about the words she had overheard in the kitchen. They did not sting the way some might expect. If anything, they confirmed what she had suspected. Vanessa did not know who she was dealing with. Eleanor smiled faintly to herself. The beauty of being underestimated was that you could decide when to reveal the truth, and when you did, it was always on your terms. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My sleep had been shallow, the kind where your mind keeps circling the same thoughts over and over. The taste of last night's dinner still lingered in my memory, not from the food, but from the bitterness of what was said. I knew I needed to talk to someone who would give me clarity without judgment. So I called Margaret, my oldest and most trusted friend. We had known each other since we were both 20, fresh-faced and full of plans. She was the kind of person who could listen to my anger and hurt without telling me I was overreacting. When I told her what happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she simply said, "Meet me at the coffee shop. We need to talk in person." By the time I arrived, Margaret was already there, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She gave me one of those looks that said she'd already made up her mind about the situation. I sat down, and before I could say a word, she leaned in. "You've always been the calm one, Jean," she began, "but I think it's time you stop letting people mistake your calm for weakness. What your daughter-in-law said to you wasn't just rude, it was meant to make you feel small. And you're not small." Her words struck me harder than I expected. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window, watching strangers rush past. For years, I had worked hard to keep the peace in my family, to avoid conflicts, to be the glue that held everyone together. But now, I was starting to wonder if my quiet tolerance had allowed a deeper disrespect to take root. Margaret took a slow breath, her voice steady. "Jean, you're not just a mother-in-law. You are a woman who has lived, who has built something for herself. If they don't value you for who you are, maybe it's time they see just how much you bring to the table." I felt the weight of her words. My mind flickered to the truth I had kept hidden for decades, the truth about my finances. My daughter-in-law had no idea that the woman she so casually dismissed as a pest was worth $60 million. I had kept that part of my life private, not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because I believed in modesty and simplicity. My wealth was the result of years of strategic investments, careful planning, and a lifetime of work that had started with almost nothing. I had never flaunted it. I drove a modest car, wore simple clothes, and lived in a comfortable but unassuming house. To them, I was just Mom or Jean, the one who baked pies for family gatherings and remembered everyone's birthdays. They didn't know that behind those gentle gestures was a sharp mind, a risk-taker who had turned small opportunities into an empire. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "Jean, sometimes people need to be reminded of who they are talking to. Not out of pride, but out of self-respect. You can still be kind, but you don't have to be invisible." Her words lit something inside me. I realized that my calm reply the night before had only been the first step. This wasn't just about my pride, it was about setting the record straight. Not to humiliate anyone, but to make it clear that respect in this family was not optional. We talked for another hour, weaving through stories of the past and sharing quiet laughter. But under it all, my mind was already forming a plan. I would not confront them in anger. I would not raise my voice. Instead, I would show them, in the most undeniable way, exactly who I was and what I stood for. By the time I left the coffee shop, the air felt lighter, and my steps were steadier. Margaret had reminded me of a truth I had forgotten: calmness is not weakness, and silence is not the same as submission. I had been underestimated for far too long, and it was time to change that. The dining room was eerily quiet after that night. The silverware had been cleared, the plates stacked in the kitchen sink, and the clinking of glasses had faded into silence. Yet the weight of my daughter-in-law's words lingered in the air like a stubborn scent that refused to vanish. I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, the one with a soft cushion and a slightly frayed armrest from years of use, looking out at the garden. The roses were in bloom, their deep reds and pinks glowing in the morning light. Normally, this view brought me comfort. Today, it only reminded me how quickly beauty could be overshadowed by ugliness. The memory replayed with uninvited clarity. Her voice, smooth and careless, had carried across the table as she laughed. "You can be such a pest sometimes," she had said, as if swatting away a fly. The others chuckled, not realizing or perhaps not caring how those words cut. I had smiled politely, sipping my water, but my chest felt tight. I wondered if they noticed how my hand shook just slightly when I set my glass down. It was not the word itself that hurt the most. I had been called worse things in my lifetime. It was the way she said it, like I was an inconvenience, like my presence at my own son's table was something she tolerated rather than welcomed. That morning, the house was empty. My son had gone to work early, and she was out running errands. The stillness gave me space to think. I poured myself a cup of tea, its warmth seeping into my hands, and let my mind wander back over the years. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the late nights, the missed opportunities, the years of putting everyone else's needs before my own. I thought about my husband, gone for over a decade now, and how proud he had been of the family we built. He would not have taken kindly to anyone calling me a pest. When you've lived nearly 7 decades, you learn that not every insult needs to be answered in the moment. Sometimes the most powerful response is not the one that comes quickly, but the one that is shaped with intention, sharpened by thought, and delivered with precision. I had always kept my wealth private. My late husband and I built our fortune quietly through wise investments, careful planning, and relentless work. Even our son knew only fragments of the truth. To the world, I was a retired schoolteacher living in a modest, well-kept home. People saw the woman in comfortable cardigans, tending her roses, and assumed that was all there was. Her careless remark had made me realize something: she saw me exactly as she wanted to see me, and nothing more. But that was about to change. The clock ticked softly in the corner as I began to think about my next steps. This would not be about revenge. I did not believe in wasting energy on bitterness. This would be about clarity, about showing her that the woman she dismissed so easily carried far more weight in this family than she realized. I finished my tea and stood, my knees creaking slightly. In the study, I unlocked the drawer where I kept my financial records. Folders, statements, and deeds lay neatly arranged, each a testament to decades of careful work. I ran my hand over them, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. When the time came, I would let her see the truth, not to boast, not to humiliate, but to shift the balance of power back where it belonged. And when I did, I would do it with the same composure I had shown at that dinner table, because sometimes the sweetest form of justice is simply allowing someone to realize the enormity of their mistake without you ever raising your voice. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to make her see. The rain had stopped by evening, but the streets still glistened with the remnants of the storm, reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps. I sat in my living room with the lights off, the curtains pulled just wide enough for me to watch the neighborhood in silence. My cup of tea had long gone cold, yet I kept it in my hands, letting the porcelain warm my palms more than my heart. All day I had been bracing for something, an explanation, a knock on the door, a message, anything that could unravel the knot that had been twisting in my chest since the day I found out the truth about the house. But the hours slipped by, and the only sounds were the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional car passing by. It was close to midnight when my phone lit up on the coffee table. The name on the screen was one I had not seen in weeks: Lena, my son's wife. The woman who had once smiled at me like I was family, who had poured me tea in my own kitchen as though she belonged there, who now held the strings to everything that used to be mine. I answered without thinking. Hello? My voice sounded steady, but my grip on the phone was tight enough to hurt. There was a pause before she spoke. We need to talk, she said, her tone clipped but with a faint tremor beneath it. I thought you made it clear there was nothing left for us to talk about, I replied, keeping my voice calm. This isn't about the past, she said quickly. It's about what's coming. Her words didn't make sense at first, but before I could press her, she continued. Can I come over? It's important. I considered telling her no. I considered hanging up and turning off my phone. But there was a part of me, a stubborn, aching part, that wanted to look her in the eyes and hear exactly what she thought she could say to me now. Come, I said, but you won't like what I have to say. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, I didn't bother to straighten my hair or put on a warmer expression. I opened the door to find her standing there, drenched from the knees down. Her coat unbuttoned and clinging to her. Her eyes searched my face as though looking for permission to step inside. I gave a small nod, and she entered without a word. We sat across from each other at the dining table. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't ask how she'd been. I just waited. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it toward me. "These are copies of the documents," she said. "Everything about the transfer, the mortgage, and the adjustments your son made afterward." I didn't touch the folder. "Why are you giving me this?" Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag. "Because I think you've been lied to more than I realized. And because I can't keep pretending I'm not part of this mess." Her words landed heavily. "Between us." I opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages. There it was in black and white signatures, dates, legal jargon, and something I hadn't expected. My son had not only transferred the house to Lena's name but had taken out a significant loan against it, leaving the property in debt. "You knew about this," I said, looking up at her. "I knew about the transfer," she admitted. "But the loan?" "He did that without telling me. I only found out when the bank called last week." I felt my pulse quicken, my mind struggling to process the scope of his actions. "So you're saying my son lied to both of us?" Her silence was answer enough. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. "What do you expect me to do with this?" "Fight," she said simply. "Take him to court. Protect what's yours. I'll testify if I have to." I stared at her, trying to decide if this was guilt, manipulation, or self-preservation. Perhaps it was all three. And why now? Why not before he put me out of my own home? Her lips trembled slightly. "Because I didn't care then. I wanted the house. I wanted what he promised me. But now I see the way he treats people he claims to love. And I know it's only a matter of time before I'm next." Her honesty cut through me like glass. I had waited for my son to admit his betrayal, but instead, it was his wife who sat before me, confessing the truth. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words pressing into my chest. "You think you're saving yourself," I said, "but you've already chosen your side." "I'm trying to make it right," she whispered. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The woman who had taken my home and the mother who had raised a man capable of giving it away. Two people bound by the same betrayal, sitting in the wreckage he had left behind. Finally, I spoke. "Leave the folder. I'll decide what to do." She hesitated, then slid it toward me again before standing up. At the door, she paused. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't reply. When the door closed behind her, I sat in the quiet for a long time, the folder before me like an unopened wound. I knew one thing for certain: whatever came next would not be quiet, and it would not be kind. I arrived at Mr. Caldwell's office early, clutching a small leather notebook I had been using to document every conversation, every shift in Ethan's story, and every gut instinct that told me something was terribly wrong. The air outside was crisp, the kind that sharpens your senses, and I could feel my heart thumping as I stepped inside. The receptionist smiled politely, but her eyes flickered with that silent acknowledgement people have when they know you are here for something difficult. "Mrs. Harper, Mr. Caldwell will see you now," she said, gesturing toward a heavy oak door. I stepped into his office and was greeted by the warm scent of old paper and polished wood. Mr. Caldwell rose from behind his desk, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression steady. "Jean," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "please, have a seat. I understand you have concerns about the transfer of your property." Concerns. That word felt too soft, too fragile for what was happening. This was not a matter of mild worry. This was a battle for the truth. I sat down, placing my notebook on the table, and opened it to the first page. "Mr. Caldwell, my son told me he transferred my house into my name. He looked me in the eye and said the papers were signed. But when I checked, nothing had been filed." Then his wife went pale when I confronted them. "I need to know what is really happening." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Do you have any documentation at all from them?" I shook my head. "Only words. And words can vanish faster than smoke." He nodded slowly. "Then our first step is to confirm ownership records with the county. Once we know exactly where things stand, we can decide the next move." "But Jean, if the property has already been moved into someone else's name, and without your consent, we may be looking at fraud. The word hit me like a stone. Fraud. I took a deep breath and told him about the evening when Ethan claimed everything was done. How his wife's face had drained of color. How they had suddenly started avoiding me in conversations. How small details in Ethan's version of events kept shifting. Mr. Caldwell listened without interrupting, his pen moving across a legal pad. When I finished, he looked up. You are right to trust your instincts. I have been practicing for 30 years, and I can tell you this. When someone starts changing their story, they are almost always hiding something. He excused himself for a moment, returning with a file pulled from his cabinet. I already requested the latest property records when you called me last week. The official deed still lists you as owner. But, and this is important, there was an application submitted 2 months ago to transfer ownership to Ethan. It is incomplete, meaning it has not gone through. But the attempt was made. A cold shiver ran down my spine. So he tried to take the house, or someone using his name did, Caldwell replied carefully. The application was missing a signature. The signature missing is yours. I gripped the edge of the chair, which means they either thought they could convince me later or they were planning to forge it. He gave a grim nod. That is a possibility. My advice is this. We formally withdraw any pending applications. Put a legal block on the properties so no transfer can be made without your personal appearance, and start keeping detailed records of every interaction from here forward. I nodded. My decision already made. Do it! I am not going to lose my home to lies. As he started drafting the necessary paperwork, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, but there was also a growing steel inside me. A part of me that had been too willing to believe my son's assurances was now wide awake. I could not unsee the truth. When I left the office, I felt taller. The world outside seemed sharper, more real. I had taken the first step in a battle I had not asked for, but one I was prepared to fight. Ethan might have thought I was too trusting, too easily persuaded. He was about to learn that trust, once broken, can turn into something far more powerful. Resolve. The morning light filtered through my curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the wooden floorboards. My heart was still restless from the night before, replaying every word, every sideways glance, every silence that seemed louder than a scream. I could not shake the feeling that something was being hidden from me, something that had been in plain sight, but I was too trusting to question. I made myself a cup of tea, holding the warm mug between my hands, letting the steam rise into my face. It was a small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Then I went to the drawer in my study where I kept all my important papers. If David had truly transferred the house to my name, there would be proof. I would have the title deed, the legal documents, the official confirmation. My mind had been dancing between belief and disbelief for days, but I knew paper did not lie. I pulled open the drawer and began sorting through the files. My fingers trembled slightly as I moved aside tax forms, insurance policies, and old letters. There it was, my property folder, neatly labeled. I opened it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The first thing I noticed was that the most recent document in the file was from 2 years ago, when I had last paid the property tax. There was nothing new. No updated ownership papers. No legal record showing my name as the sole owner. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking under me. If the house was truly mine, it would be here. But instead, all I found was absence. An absence that screamed louder than any piece of evidence could. My mind raced back to David's words, to his wife's pale face when I told them I had not received the transfer. She knew. Her reaction was not shock at my question. It was fear at my knowledge. The phone rang suddenly, making me jump. I glanced at the caller. It was Margaret, my old friend from the neighborhood committee. She had worked with the local land registry for years. I picked up and tried to keep my voice steady. Margaret, I need to ask you a favor, I said. Could you check the registry for my property? I just need to confirm something. She didn't hesitate. Of course, Jean. Give me an hour. That hour felt like a lifetime. I busied myself with dusting the shelves, watering the plants, folding laundry that did not need folding. Anything to keep my hands moving while my thoughts clawed at my chest. When Margaret called back, Her voice was quieter than usual. "Jean, I'm not sure how to say this, but the property is not in your name. In fact, it was transferred 6 months ago to a joint title between David and his wife." The world seemed to tilt under me. I gripped the edge of the table, the phone pressed tightly to my ear. "Are you certain?" "Yes," she said gently. I checked twice to be sure. "I am so sorry." I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. The truth was no longer hidden, it was sitting right in front of me, cold and undeniable. David had lied. His wife had lied. They had both stood in my home, looked me in the eye, and told me a story they knew was false. But now that I had proof, the next step was clear. I would not confront them with just words. I would confront them with the very evidence that would tear apart their lies. And when I did, they would not be able to look away. I poured myself another cup of tea, though this time my hands were steady. The fear had been replaced with resolve. They had taken my kindness for weakness. That mistake would be their undoing. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, the faint light of dawn barely touching the edges of my curtains. The air in the room was heavy, as though it already knew that the day ahead would demand more strength than I had left. I sat up slowly, my hands resting on the bed, feeling the tremor in my fingers. Sleep had been shallow and restless, filled with the echoes of yesterday's words. My mind replayed them like a broken record, each repetition cutting deeper. By the time I reached the kitchen, the kettle was already whistling. It was habit now to make tea, to stand by the counter while the steam curled into the cold air, to hold the cup in my palms as though it could warm more than my fingers. My thoughts wandered to Michael, my son, the boy I had carried, the child whose fevered forehead I had once cooled with the same hands that now felt like strangers to my own body. He was no longer a boy. He was a man with his own house, his own life, his own walls that no longer had space for me. The memory of our last conversation hit me with the force of a blow. His voice had been sharp, his eyes cold in a way I had never seen before. He spoke as though I were not his mother, but an intruder. His wife stood behind him, her arms folded, her lips pressed tight. I had come to drop off a casserole I knew they liked, but by the time I left, it felt as though I had been dropping off my last piece of hope. I sat at the kitchen table, my tea untouched, staring at the way the morning light spread across the surface. There was a stillness in the room, yet inside me everything was in motion, memories colliding with each other, anger flaring, grief clawing at the edges of my chest. I wondered when the line had been crossed. When had love turned into obligation in his eyes? When had I gone from being someone he relied on to someone he resented? By noon, I could no longer sit still. I pulled out the wooden box from the cabinet. In the hallway, the one that held documents, photographs, and letters. Inside, I found the old family pictures. There was one of Michael at age 6, wearing a paper crown from his birthday party, chocolate frosting smeared across his cheek. His smile had been pure joy, wide and unguarded. I traced the edges of that photograph, remembering how he used to run to me, arms open, as though I were the safest place in the world. I set the picture aside and pulled out another, a school graduation, the day he told me he was leaving for university. I remembered how proud I had been, how certain I was that he would thrive. I had hugged him tightly, telling him that no matter where life took him, my home would always be his. I had meant it with every beat of my heart. But now, sitting here, I was not sure he even thought of it as his home anymore. The phone rang suddenly, shattering the silence. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, hoping it might be him. It was not. It was Helen, an old friend from the neighborhood. She asked how I was, and for a moment, I considered lying. But my voice betrayed me. It cracked when I said I was fine. She listened quietly as I told her about the growing distance between Michael and me, about the coldness in his tone, about the feeling of being pushed out of my own family. Helen sighed and said something I had not allowed myself to consider. Sometimes, she said, the hardest part of being a parent is learning when to let go, not because you want to, but because holding on will destroy you. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. Letting go. Could I do it? Could I truly stop trying to fix what was broken, even if it meant losing the last thread between us? My heart resisted the thought, but my mind, tired and bruised, whispered that maybe it was the only way to protect myself. That evening, I decided to write Michael a letter. Not a letter of anger, but one of truth. I sat at my desk, pen in hand, the paper stark and waiting. The words came slowly at first, but soon they spilled out. I told him about the love that had shaped my life, about the pride I felt in the man he had become, about the hurt I carried from his recent words and actions. I told him I would always be here if he needed me, but I could no longer stand at the door, knocking on a heart that would not open. By the time I signed my name, the room was dark. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. I did not know if I would send it. I only knew that writing it had been like breathing after holding my breath for too long. I sat in the quiet, my hands resting in my lap, and I realized something. This was my breaking point. Not the end of love, because a mother's love does not vanish, but the end of the constant reaching, the endless giving without being seen. It was time to reclaim what little strength I had left. Tomorrow, I would decide whether to mail the letter. Tonight, I would let myself feel the weight of the choice. And for the first time in months, I allowed the silence to be a comfort, rather than a punishment. I stood in the center of my living room, the very room that had once been filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, and the smell of my fresh-baked bread. Now, it felt like a courtroom. My son sat on the sofa with his wife beside him, her lips pressed into that thin line I had come to know as her silent verdict. On the coffee table between us lay a stack of legal papers, neat, heavy, and cold. "I'm only going to say this once," I began, my voice calm but unshakable. "This house is mine. It always has been, and it will remain mine until the day I choose otherwise. I will not be tricked, pressured, or sweet-talked into giving it away." His eyes darted toward his wife, then back to me. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We could make better use of it. You don't need all this space." I leaned forward. "Better use? You mean turning it into an investment property so you can live off the rent while I get pushed into a cramped apartment somewhere?" "That is not happening." For the first time, his wife spoke. "We're thinking about the future. Our future. This is about security for the family." I turned my gaze to her. "And yet you seem to think the only security worth having is yours. When you marry into a family, you become a part of it. You don't dismantle it and sell the pieces for profit." A flush crept into her cheeks. My son shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. The silence stretched between us, thick and unyielding. I straightened my back. "This conversation ends today. I have already spoken to my lawyer, and every detail is in writing. This house will never leave my name without my consent. And I am making sure that no one, not even my own son, can sign it away behind my back." The look in his eyes shifted, part frustration, part something I couldn't quite name, but I knew what it was. He realized I was no longer the mother who quietly swallowed her hurt to keep the peace. I was done being cornered. "I don't want to fight with you," he finally muttered. "Neither do I replied. "But I will fight for myself if I have to, and I will win." I stood, signaling the meeting was over. They left without another word, and when the front door clicked shut, the air seemed lighter. I walked to the window, watching them cross the driveway. I thought of the years I had given, the love I had poured, and the trust that had been broken. This was not the ending I had ever imagined for us. But perhaps it was the beginning of something else, a life where my dignity and independence came first. I would not let anyone take that from me again. The house was quiet again. Not the uneasy silence that had filled it after my son's betrayal, but a calm, steady quiet that felt like the closing of a heavy door. I stood by the window, watching the late afternoon light spill across the yard, the same yard where my children once played. For years, I thought my love for them was unshakable, unchangeable, but I had learned that love can survive without blind obedience, and sometimes protecting yourself means stepping away. I had given my son every chance to make things right. I had listened, I had hoped, and I had forgiven more times than I could count. But he had chosen his path, a path where my dignity was optional, where my trust was expendable. That was the day I chose mine. The house was still mine, in name and in spirit. Every wall, every creak in the floorboard, every patch of worn carpet held my story, not the one he tried to rewrite. I had rebuilt my will, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The people who would inherit what I leave behind would be those who stood by me when I had nothing to give but my truth. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon gold. I thought of the woman I had been before all this, the mother who believed that sacrifice was the only language of love. I was not that woman anymore. I still loved my children, but I loved myself too, and that love demanded boundaries. Some might say I was harsh, others might say I was brave. I say I was simply honest, and in that honesty, I found peace. I turned from the window, locking it for the night. My life would move forward, and so would I, untethered from the weight of betrayal, free from the need for approval. I walked through my home, my steps steady, my head high. This was not the ending my son expected, but it was the ending I chose. And sometimes that is the greatest victory of all.